What's up, nerds? Welcome to Code Reviews. I wanted to create a quick video to run through Spring Boot starter security, kind of getting started stuff, just for those who may be getting started. And it's where I'm going with my larger application. We're kind of at this part, but I wanted to do a little appendix, a little extra review. So in this brief video, here's some objectives. We're going to add and configure Spring Security to our user APIs that we created. So we have a get that gets enabled users, a post that creates a user in a database, and a put that does a soft delete of a user. And then we are going to not require authentication for our get actuator health check. And then we're going to review basic authorization with Spring, and we will go over the default values. They setting values in the properties file so that you don't have to use their defaults, and then we'll demonstrate what authorization means, basic authorization with these curl requests. If you remember, have these APIs that work. No matter what you do, we have a get that gets all users. You can even create a user, but anybody can do this. There is no authorization. You just have to curl the API. It's not secure at all. There's a lot we need to do there. So how do you add a level of security? How do you get started with Spring Security with these user APIs? The first thing you need to do is update your pom.xml, and we can add the Spring Boot starter security library. And when we add this and load our Maven, we can create a security configuration. So in the configurations file, wherever your application main is, you can create a configurations directory. And I took this straight from the Spring Boot docs, but you mark the class as a configuration, and then we just get out of the box HTTP security. So we create a bean, and security filter chain is what it returns. And we pass in an HTTP security object, and from here you just authorize HTTP requests. And as our first demo, we're going to authenticate every request. So all we're going to do is a blanket. We require authorization for every controller we have in our application, and it requires HTTP basic authorization with defaults, and return that. So when we rebuild with these values, all of our APIs will no longer be reachable in that same way. So we have a controller. This is where our get and our posts are, but it's all right. So we just tried the get request again, and you get a 401, which means unauthorized. And if you try the post request, you'll see the same thing, verbose, 401 are authorized. So that's fine. You're kind of like, great, I didn't want people to use that anyway. But we also had a get request for a health check, which is just something that we need to be publicly accessible. Actuator.health v. That's also 401 authorized, which is an issue. So we've updated our POM and put the artifact in. We've created our configuration file. We've marked the bean, and we've set up the security filter chain. And what we haven't done is add permit without authentication. So we require authentication for everything right now. But what we want to do, I'll make the change and then reboot. So I made a change. I'm going to restart the app. So with the change I made, it says request matchers, and then you have a pattern, which is just a string, a regex string. And it's saying anything that starts with actuator, permit it. So permit all just means don't worry about authentication. So the way it was working before we added authentication is the way it should work now. But everything else should still require authentication and throw a 401 unauthorized. So we'll do the health check. That worked. You can see it says status up. Get rid of the reliefs. Cool. And then, but if we try to create a user, you're still 401 unauthorized. Great. So now if you look at our docs, we're permitting what we want to permit. We want whoever's checking the health to be able to check the health. But everyone else who's managing users should require some type of authentication. Awesome. So with basic authentication, you need a username and a password added to the header. But what is the username and password? We really didn't do anything. So in Spring, the default user name will just be user. So the username is user, and then the password by default will be auto-generated, and it's printed to the console when the Spring Boot app is started. And what you're looking for is using generated security password, whatever. And if we go back to where we started the application, you can see that it's right here, using generated security password, and here's the hash. So the username is user, and the password is this. And when you add that to your curl request, and you have to encode it, it will work. So let's see an example. All right, here we go. So we're kind of skipping ahead, but to demonstrate, we have this curl request. So the default is user, and then we have to plug in a password, and we get the password here. And what you're seeing is, okay, curl, get, whatever, that this H option is a header. So we're doing authorization basic. And what we're doing here is we're casting the username :password in base64 encoding as the authorization, and then we're trying to hit users. And so once we've done this, it actually works. If any of these values are wrong, I'll do -v again. Once again, you get 401 unauthorized. So those are the default username and passwords. But you really don't, I mean, you can if you want for development, you can do whatever you want. But you may not want to do that. You may just want to develop with constants. So you have Spring Security user.name PJL, that replaces the user default, and then you have Spring Security user.password ABC, and that replaces the default auto-generated password. So if we go back and we try this again, we can do PJL, we do ABC 1, 2, 3. Gotta wait for it to start. Just check what else do we have there. So that's what I'm saying, setting values in application.properties file. So this will override the default. Great. So as you can see, we're using the PJL ABC 1, 2, 3, and we're casting it to, or we're encoding it, and everything works. So yeah, I kind of skipped ahead, but that's how it works with curl. So unauthenticated requests, like the health check, you don't need any special headers. You can just do curl, and you can get the status right there. But it won't work when you have basic authentication on. Basic authentication requires you to, again, base64 encode the username :password, and then add that as the authorization :space basic space. So do that, boom, you have it. And for post requests, so you're like, great, that should work with posts, but it doesn't. Why doesn't it work? Spring Security has this CSRF enabled by default. And CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery. I'm not going to go into this. If you work, some of your front ends may take care of this type of stuff, but it's basically a way to protect you from certain attacks. And by default, it will block unsafe HTTP methods such as post requests. So the GET request worked, but the post request didn't. So the post request didn't work, and it didn't work because CSRF was enabled by default. So we've disabled it, and now when you do a curl post, put in your authorization, you can create a user. Whether you should leave it disabled or not, I can't tell you. It depends about your app, but if you need to get it working for development, that's one of the things you need to get working. So now we have basic authentication. Everything's accessible that was accessible before. When we make calls, we just need to make sure the header with the username and password is set. Hope this was helpful. Thanks.